End of film.
"1945. The war against Nazi Germany was over. For millions around the world, the Allied victory meant the chance to return home. But even as the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and Great Britain celebrated, Joseph Stalin and his secret police began their own Holocaust, rounding up foreigners unlucky enough to be caught in Soviet zones. These political prisoners, or zeks as they were called, were sent to gulags, forced labor camps in the harshest regions of the Soviet Union. Only a few survived. They are the last witnesses of a brutal crime against humanity, which history has overlooked.
My name is John Noble. I spent almost 10 years in the Gulag system of the Soviet Union, in spite of the fact that I am an American citizen, born and raised in the United States.
John Noble's father emigrated from Germany to the United States in 1822, became an American citizen, and raised a family. In the mid-1930s, he returned to his hometown of Dresden, where he built a camera factory. John was visiting his father in 1939 when World War II broke out. As Americans, they were automatically placed under local arrest. They lived out the rest of the war under Swiss consular protection. When the tide turned against the Nazis, they were confined to their home. Soon the German army was in full retreat. Russian tanks were closing in, and liberation seemed close at hand.
In 1945, when the Red Army moved into Dresden, we were anxiously wanting to be liberated. The Soviet Army moved up to the city limits during the night, and on May 6th, about 6 in the morning, immediately all over the city, white flags were coming up. The city was surrendering. At 8 that morning, the Soviet troops moved in. It was a horrible scene. The raping, the murders, the shooting, the looting, all these things that were far beyond anything that we had heard or we could believe. Our family was spared this horror at the time because we had an American flag flying on the roof and on the tower. And somehow the Soviets apparently hid this flag. But American former prisoners of war and British former prisoners of war, seeing the flag, came here, believing there might be an outpost from America here. But since this was not an outpost, they stayed here a day or two and then went on to the west. The Soviets did not like this. And therefore, I think some of the preparations were already being made for our arrest.
Trapped in their home, John Noble and his father spent their time planning an escape to the American zone. When they contacted American authorities, they were told that Russian aggression against Americans was inconceivable. 2 months after the occupation of Dresden, Stalin's secret security force tore down the American flag on the Noble home. John and his father were seized. After weeks of torture, they were taken to the Münchenplatz prison, where they discovered that other foreigners were being systematically rounded up.
The other 700 prisoners that were there were mothers, fathers, children, intellectuals, doctors, lawyers, but some of them even just snatched off the street without a word of explanation. There were Russians there. There were people from other countries there. Allies, people that were fighting with them to win the World War II. That is not acceptable in my mind. For 7 months, I was held in a cell just like this. The only difference was here was a metal cot that folded down. table, bench folded away. But to be in here for 7 months without once setting a foot outside of the door was almost unbearable. Later on, from March 1946 on, I was responsible for the records of the prisoner. If he died, if he was executed, I had to keep those records. Torture at the time of interrogation was immense. Sometimes men, sometimes women, sometimes just boys and girls. Their backs from necks down to their hips. Just a mess of skin and blood and shirt, everything whipped into each other. The court met every few days. And sometimes people were even sentenced to death. And the executions took place right here in the prison. The people taken out of their cells, put into death row, and on execution days brought out into the hallway. There they were stripped of their clothing. It was my job to take the clothing off the floor and bring it to cells where they needed clothes. But the prisoner was marched out into the other part of the prison building, and out there given instructions, turn to the right and turn to the left and so on. And while still turning, the officer would shoot the prisoner in the back of the neck, and then the bodies were shoved into a sunken pit. And then we workers had to roll barrels of gasoline through, which was poured over the bodies, and they were burned. 21,000 cards passed through my hands during the time while I was keeping the records. And out of these 21,000 people, only 15 human beings were ever released.
In September 1946, after a year in prison, John and his father were transferred to Buchenwald, the Nazi death camp liberated by Americans, but now under Soviet control.
I was here for almost 2 years, but this was during the communist time. Most people remember Buchenwald from the Nazi time, the horrors that took place, but I don't know what happened afterwards. 23 days they tortured me, but I was an American. Other foreign nationals were held here. People from every part of the world were held here during the communist time, but it seemed as though nobody cared.